Today I'm going to talk to you about the difference between AI model training and fine-tuning and retrieval augmented generation. So these are two different processes that are very important to understand from a security and compliance perspective because they impact how your data is handled and retained. So to start with, we'll talk about training and fine-tuning. And fine-tuning is really just a way that you can train an AI model. So I'm going to include it in the same category. So when you're training an AI model, what's happening is you've got, your data here, and then you've got your model. And essentially you're embedding this data into the weights of this model. And this is more or less a permanent process. There is some discussion about techniques like machine unlearning, where it is possible to remove some of these weights reflecting this data from a model, but that's an advanced topic and it's not entirely clear how effective that is. So we're going to just assume for now that model training is forever. Now, when this data is embedded into the model's weights, and especially if the model is available to other people, then you have a scenario where you could potentially experience what I call unintended training. So that's the first risk from training and fine-tuning from a security perspective, unintended training. Now this happens when a model is trained on information that the provider of that information, in retrospect, probably wouldn't want the model to have been trained on. Here's an example from the real world. When ChatGPT was released at the end of 2022, it then, and still does, by default, train on all the inputs that are provided to it. So if you just go on to chatgpt.com and start typing in information, OpenAI is training its models, or can train its models, on that data. Now, Amazon engineers reportedly began using ChatGPT to provide lots of sensitive information like internal architectures, their code base, in order to help design products. So it's likely, and there's evidence to suggest, that OpenAI did train on that information, and then ChatGPT started reproducing it to other users of the system. So unintended training is a vector by which AI can learn from information provided to it and then regurgitate that to third parties who shouldn't have access to that data. Now, there are a couple different ways that you can mitigate this risk. First and foremost, I would say understand what data is being trained on when you are using an AI tool. That's really important. There are other things you can do, like blocking sensitive information from being provided to the model, but really understanding what and how and when training is happening is really important to avoiding this risk or mitigating this risk. All right, next up, I'm going to talk about sensitive data generation. And now, there are actually two types of this, what I call internal and external. I'm going to talk about internal sensitive data generation right now because that's most relevant to AI model training. But essentially, even if a model is not trained on personal data, it is possible that the model could infer certain personal data about, a person, their characteristics, and provide that data to external parties. So for example, this is a very obvious one. If a generative AI model knew what street I lived in, knew how big my family was, and knew that, there was, only one house that could meet the size requirements of my family, and it knew that, I happen to live on that street, then it's likely that it could infer that Walter Haydock lives at a given house. So that would be sensitive data generation. And This is mainly a compliance issue, especially from the EU GDPR perspective, because the processing of personal data can only be done under certain bases or under certain justifications. And if your model is accidentally creating this sensitive data, this personal data, then you could find yourself in some regulatory hot water. I put together a full post on this entire topic, and I'll put that in the notes. All right, finally, a risk involved in training and fine-tuning is intellectual property ownership. Now, this is a very broad topic. There are lots of different perspectives on this, and I'm not an attorney, so this is not legal advice. With that said, some things to consider are, what are the sources of information that are being provided to an AI training process, and who owns them? So if I were interacting with customers and they were providing me information about themselves, it would be very important for me to be clear that I am building models using that information and contractually establishing that I own the resulting model that has been created as a result of training on their data. You definitely do not want to leave this ambiguous and have a situation where you might have a dispute over ownership of the model. I wrote an article with an attorney on this exact topic, and I will also include that in the notes below. All right, so these are the three main risks involved with model training and fine-tuning. Next, I'm going to talk about a separate process called retrieval augmented generation. All right, so retrieval augmented generation, abbreviated RAG. In this process, what happens is an already trained model, which we'll have right here, is going to use an application that has access to a database, likely a vector store database, and it's going to pull data from this database, bring it back to the model for processing, along with whatever prompting you've given the application. So an example of this is OpenAI's GPTs functionality allow you to build what they call custom GPTs. Essentially what that's doing is allowing people to upload their own data to an application and then let the AI model process that information. Now, it's not necessarily training on that data. It might be, but that's a separate issue. I'm going to add AI model over here. That's a separate issue. What's happening is the application is using this information to enrich the response to whatever the query is. So, you could say, what is the capital of the US? Assume that's your prompt. Now, most generative AI models would be trained on that and understand what the capital of the United States is. But assume that it hadn't been trained on that information. It's possible through RAG to enrich the response. If you have a data set that says that Washington, D.C. is the capital of the United States, if you have a data set there that is accessible to the model through RAG, the model can provide a correct response grounded in that data. Now, just because this data is being processed by the model doesn't mean it's being trained on by the model. So this is potentially a way to enrich your responses in a secure and compliant manner. Now, the biggest risk here, and really the only risk that I'm going to talk about in this video, with retrieval augmented generation is what I call having a neutral security policy or a tainted trust boundary. So you want a neutral security policy and you don't want a tainted trust boundary. So a neutral security policy happens when you have a query and you're not relying on the AI model to make decisions about whether the person should get that data or not. So a neutral security policy essentially would mean that if you've got an access control group here, all this information is in the same privilege level, and you've got this is an AI application that can do RAG, and then you've got your database here, and then the query comes in, the AI application does the retrieval against the database, and then it returns a response and then spits out whatever it is. Now, the important thing here is that all of these things, including the user making the prompt, so I'll just shorten this up and I'll say, user, are all in this access control group. They are all authorized to see this data. This is okay. This is how it's supposed to be. Problems occur when you have a tainted trust boundary. Okay, so this happens when you've got a user who is able to query an AI model and these two are in one authorization group or permission group. So I'll just call this A, I'll call this A. And then the model is able to query data from a database that is in a different permissions group. Now, this can cause problems. So in this situation, and then it returns the response and then spits it out. So in this situation, I've seen people understand that this is bad, but still try to compensate by having a system prompt that instructs the AI application not to return certain things from the database. So it'll say, don't mention the secret recipe for Coke. Assuming that's stored in the database, and then using this system prompt on the AI model to try to prevent it from returning information to a user in permission group A because he's not authorized to see it because he's not in group B. That is not a good way to design an AI application and is almost certain to fail. As many people who created GPTs using OpenAI learned when the feature was first released. What happened was people had uploaded information to these GPTs, and security researchers were able to quickly extract all of that information that they had expected to be confidential and only used for grounding responses. So if you have a situation like this, make sure you have some non-AI method for confirming access to the data in question. You probably want to confirm that the user in group A is only accessing data that is allowed to be shown to people in group A, and if he's in group B, only show him data that people in group B can see. Don't use AI to do that. Use a deterministic rules-based process. Use a traditional authentication method. So, rounding it off, there are two main processes in AI training, and deployment that security and compliance professionals should be aware of. Training and fine tuning is one where the data is embedded into the model's weights. And then retrieval augmented generation is a separate process where the data is not embedded in the model weights, but is used to ground the responses. And understanding the way that these processes happen can help set you up for success from a security, compliance, and privacy perspective. Now, I'm Walter Haydock. I'm the founder and CEO of StackAware, and we help AI-powered companies measure and manage their risk. So if you're having questions about how to design your applications and you're concerned about the security implications, then go to stackaware.com and reach out. We'll get in touch right away.